If the Night King had triumphed at the Battle of Winterfell, the course of Westeros history would have been irrevocably altered, plunging the world into a perpetual winter and silencing the hopes of humanity. The moment when Arya Stark struck the killing blow was a pivotal turn in the story of the living versus the dead. Without that intervention, the implications would have been catastrophic, reshaping alliances, decimating kingdoms, and leaving the world at the mercy of an implacable foe. The immediate aftermath of the Night King's victory would have been grim. The defenders of Winterfell, despite their bravery and resilience, would have been annihilated. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and the remaining forces of the North had already been battered by the unrelenting assault of the undead. Their defenses strained, their morale shattered, and their losses mounting, they stood little chance of regrouping. The dead would rise in their thousands, swelling the Night King's army with every fallen soldier, leaving no room for recovery or counteroffensive. The once proud Stark stronghold would become a frozen monument to despair, an eternal reminder of humanity's failure to stem the tide of death. From there, the army of the dead would have marched south, a relentless tide that none could resist. With Winterfell fallen, the next target would have been the Riverlands and then King's Landing, where Cersei Lannister awaited with her own ambitions and machinations. The Golden Company, her hired army, would have been no match for an enemy that could not be cowed by conventional warfare. Elephants and disciplined infantry would have fallen to the whites and risen again, further bolstering the Night King's ranks. Cersei, unyielding as she was, would have faced the horrifying realization that the Iron Throne was meaningless in a world dominated by the undead. Yet her pride might have delayed any attempts at evacuation or alliance, sealing the fate of the capital. The psychological impact on the people of Westeros would have been staggering. The mere presence of the Night King and his horde would have shattered the fragile unity that Jon and Daenerys had struggled to forge among the living. Fear would breed desperation, and desperation would fuel betrayals, panic, and chaos. Even the staunchest lords might have turned on each other in a bid for survival, forgetting that no castle or army could withstand the frozen tide. Survival itself would have seemed an illusion, with the air growing colder, crops failing, and the natural world succumbing to the encroaching winter. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, once thought to be an insurmountable advantage, would have faced their own doom. Without a decisive strategy or the element of surprise, they might have been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the dead. Should either dragon have fallen, their resurrection under the Night King's control would have been a devastating blow, turning the tide even further against the living. The bond between Daenerys and her remaining dragon would have been tested beyond measure, as the mother of dragons fought to retain her dwindling hope amidst unimaginable losses. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, would have been a unique target for the Night King. The conflict between these two entities was not just a battle for survival, but for the very fabric of memory and history. With Bran's death, the Night King would have erased the collective knowledge and legacy of mankind, leaving the world a blank, frozen slate. The stories, wisdom, and cultural identity of Westeros would have vanished into the void, and the fight to protect those intangible yet vital elements would have been lost forever. Even if some small pockets of humanity had managed to escape and resist, their plight would have been bleak. Refugees would have fled southward, only to find dwindling supplies and increasingly hostile conditions. The once lush lands of Dorne and the Reach, untouched by the initial conflict, would have faced an onslaught of starving, desperate survivors. This internal strife would have further weakened humanity's chances, as trust and cooperation gave way to territorialism and betrayal. No one would have been safe from the dead, whose advance was as inexorable as time itself. The idea of a final stand somewhere in the south, a Harrenhal or Storm's End turned into a fortress of last hope, might have emerged among the scattered survivors. Yet such an effort would have been little more than a delaying tactic. With no time to regroup, no access to Dragonfire, and no living champions to turn the tide, any such defense would have been futile. The dead do not tire, they do not falter, and they do not negotiate. Their victory was not merely military but existential, as they sought to extinguish the flame of life itself. The political implications of the Night King's dominance cannot be overstated. Houses and allegiances would have crumbled under the weight of fear and imminent extinction. The dreams of the Targaryens, the Lannisters, and even the Starks would have dissolved into irrelevance. No one would have been left to vie for the Iron Throne, which would itself have been buried under snow and ice, a relic of a forgotten world. The great game that had consumed so many lives would have ended, not with a victor but with silence, as the throne room lay empty under a sky turned pale with frost. Humanity's only hope, had the Night King prevailed, might have rested in distant lands such as Essos. The free cities, the Dothraki Sea, and perhaps even the hidden lands beyond Asshai could have offered temporary reprieve, but they too would have ultimately succumbed to the advancing winter. With the long night spreading its icy grip, nowhere would have been safe for long. The Night King's victory was not just a conquest of Westeros, but the beginning of an eternal winter that would engulf the entire world. As the long night deepened, even the distant lands of Essos would not have been immune to the encroaching threat. The Night King's march would have been inexorable, an extension of nature's most brutal force. The free cities, though initially spared, would have faced their own reckoning as the frigid temperatures reached across the narrow sea. Refugees from Westeros might have brought warnings, but these would have done little to prepare the free cities for an enemy that defied all conventional understanding of war. Wealth and trade, the lifeblood of these cities, would have become meaningless as survival took precedence over commerce. The slave-driven economies of cities like Volantis and Slaver's Bay would have collapsed as the chaos of mass migration and freezing temperatures gripped the lands. In Meereen, Daenerys' liberated city might have attempted to rally against the impending doom, but its lack of resources and limited defenses would have left it vulnerable. The Dothraki, should any have survived their initial charge at Winterfell, would have been faced with an impossible choice. Known for their disdain of walls and fortresses, they would have found themselves cornered, their great Khalasars reduced to scattered remnants fighting a losing battle against the relentless cold and the whites. Even the mightiest Khal would have been no match for the undead, as their way of life, rooted in movement and open plains, was extinguished by a creeping, unrelenting frost. Farther east, the mysterious Shadowlands of Asshai and beyond might have seemed like a potential haven, but their isolation would have offered only temporary reprieve. The great civilizations of Essos, from the powerful Magi of Qarth to the warlike cities of the Rhoynar, would have been too divided to mount a unified defense. And without the critical knowledge of dragonglass or Valyrian steel, any resistance they mustered would have been ineffective against the undead. The intricate politics of Essos, marked by rivalries and mistrust, would have been their downfall, as they squabbled for dominance in a world that no longer cared for such vanities. In this unfolding apocalypse, the dragons might have been humanity's last hope. Rhaegal and Drogon, the surviving children of Daenerys, would have been central to any plan of resistance. However, with Daenerys herself likely dead or consumed by despair, the dragons might have fallen victim to the Night King's cunning. The loss of Viserion had already demonstrated how vulnerable these seemingly invincible creatures were to the Night King's power. Should Drogon or Rhaegal have been turned, their fiery breath transformed into icy destruction, the last ember of hope for humanity would have been snuffed out. The dragons, once symbols of rebirth and power, would have become tools of annihilation, heralding the final extinction of the living. The spiritual and mythological impact of the Night King's victory would have been as profound as the physical destruction. In Westeros, the faiths that had long guided and divided humanity would have faltered in the face of such overwhelming terror. The Seven, the Old Gods, the Drowned God, and even R'hllor, the Lord of Light, would have seemed powerless against the Night King's might. Melisandre's fiery proclamations and sacrifices, her unwavering belief in the prophecy of Azor Ahai, would have been proven futile. The idea of a destined savior would have been rendered meaningless, as humanity realized too late that their collective survival depended not on prophecy but on unity, something they had failed to achieve in time. Even the three-eyed raven, the living repository of the world's history and memory, would have been destroyed. The Night King's singular purpose, to erase the memory of mankind, would have been fulfilled, plunging the world into a literal and metaphorical darkness. This loss of memory, of identity, and of cultural heritage would have been a final, devastating blow to the living. The stories of great houses, the wisdom of maesters, and the legends of heroes would have disappeared, leaving behind a blank, frozen canvas devoid of meaning. Small enclaves of humanity might have survived in isolated pockets, perhaps in hidden valleys, remote islands, or deep within the labyrinthine caves of Westeros and Essos. These survivors, though, would have been doomed to a grim and tenuous existence, cut off from each other and hunted relentlessly by the undead. Without the resources to rebuild civilization or the knowledge to combat the Night King, these remnants of humanity would have slowly dwindled, their light fading over generations until nothing remained. The Night King's triumph would not merely signify the end of humanity but the end of all life as it was known. The natural world, already in decline from the advance of eternal winter, would have withered entirely. Forests would have become lifeless husks, rivers and seas frozen solid, and animals either slaughtered or turned into grotesque parodies of themselves under the Night King's influence. The intricate balance of life, once teeming with diversity and growth, would have been replaced by a cold, unfeeling stillness. Yet, in the face of such despair, the human spirit might have clung to the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, in some forgotten corner of the world, a small group of scholars or warriors might have preserved the knowledge of dragonglass or Valyrian steel. Perhaps a descendant of House Stark or Targaryen, a shadow of the heroes who once stood against the dead, would have carried on the fight, even if only symbolically. But these flickers of resistance would have been brief and ultimately inconsequential against the vastness of the Night King's dominion. The story of Westeros, Essos, and the entire known world would have ended not with a triumphant song or a bittersweet conclusion, but with silence. The triumph of the Night King would have reduced the world to a frozen wasteland, devoid of life, color, and hope. It would have been the ultimate reminder of the fragility of life and the cost of division. Humanity, in its arrogance and constant infighting, would have sown the seeds of its own destruction, leaving nothing behind but the endless, unbroken cold of an eternal winter.